Hi, I'm Ken Tyberski. I'm here today to talk to Rick Giombetti, learn a little bit about the history of Giombetti Associates, how it all began, how it started, what the business is about, what's behind the magic curtain, and I hope it's going to be interesting. I think it will be. Hi, Rick. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm glad to be here. I look forward to our conversation.
All right, so tell me a little about pre-Giombetti Associates. What was the world like for you? What were you doing?
Wow, where do I begin?
At the beginning.
At the beginning. I think I was born in Kentucky, the Blue Hills. There was swaddling clothes, and I think I had a midwife was a raccoon, I think. But I'm not sure, though. It might have been Kentucky or Louisiana. Okay, let's get serious. Before Giombetti Associates, I was in the United States Navy for 4 years. And I went in 1967. So I spent 4 years in California. I was dating a young lady at that time who eventually became my wife, Andrea. And it was, I think, a great time of my life in terms of growing up, growing from a young man into a man that really probably appreciated and understood life more because of the military experience. Spent some time in Vietnam. After that experience, I went back to the University of Massachusetts where I enrolled, and my wife, not at the time, Andrea, was a junior there. So I decided to go back to school, and spent 4 years at the University of Massachusetts and graduated with an undergraduate degree, believe it or not, in wildlife and forestry.
Forestry. Did you have like the same hat Smokey the Bear wears, or?
You know, it was pretty cool. What I wanted to do is I always wanted to work outdoors.
Sure.
And at the time, I knew going in that the only availability of an opportunity in terms of work would either be through the state or the federal government. So I went down that path, continued, graduated with a 4-year degree, and when I graduated, I couldn't find work anywhere. There was nothing available in the field of forestry or wildlife or whatever. So I said, what am I going to do now? So I talked to my wife, and I said, I'm going to go back to school. And believe it or not, I took a whole different path. At the time, after I graduated from college, I went to work for the State Division of Employment Security for Massachusetts. They called it DES at the time. And I worked in that environment for about 4 years as what they call a counselor. And so we interviewed people, helped them find jobs, and it was kind of people that were either on unemployment, that mandatorily had to come in and talk to someone that was an employment counselor to get them off the unemployment rolls back to work, or people who were coming in looking for jobs. So I did that, and I decided that I was going to go back to school and get a degree in psychology.
You must have met all kinds of people there.
It was really an interesting experience for sure.
I'll bet.
It gave me a great foundation and an understanding that I think one of my strengths that I realized when I was younger, that I was always intuitive. I had a sixth sense that I recognized that I could read people, situations, and that sixth sense and intuitiveness led me down the road of psychology, and I said, you know what, I might be able to parlay this degree into something, counseling or working in an agency or something. I had no idea that I wanted to go into business for myself at that time. So I did. I went back to school, I enrolled at Westfield State College, and I got a degree in counseling psychology.
So was that born out of the people that you met while you were at, what'd you say it was, DES?
DES, the Department of Employment Security, they call it, the State Employment/Unemployment Office.
So was there a link to you considering psychology based on what you had experienced at DES?
Yeah, there was. Because I was doing that for a living, interacting with people, and either helping them out in finding employment, or believe it or not, it turns out that this counselor position came across all kinds of situations. People would come in and talk to me about anything and everything, from family problems, from marital issues. I remember a young lady coming into the office one day and told me that she had just been raped. dealing with, I worked in the employment office at the time. I helped young people to get into what they call the Job Corps.
Yeah.
The Job Corps was over in Chicopee, Massachusetts, and I helped young inner city youth find themselves, get into the Job Corps in terms of a career. It was either in the trades or something that really took them out of the inner cities and tried to make something out of themselves. That impacted me. I always knew that I cared. I was a pretty empathic, caring, sensitive guy with strong emotions for helping others. And during that period of time in the employment office, I said, you know what, this is a great opportunity for me. So if I went on and got a degree in psychology, I knew that I could help somebody somewhere doing something. I didn't know what it would be at the time.
Yeah.
But that's what drove me back to go back to school and get a degree.
And you felt good at it.
Yeah, it was great. It was a great feeling. It was very fulfilling.
Yeah.
I saved a lot of lives in terms of young kids that would have been into drugs. Or I can remember a specific experience where I went into a home in the inner city of Holyoke, Massachusetts. And I was working with this young man, was probably 15, 16 years old, troubled youth, dropout, wasn't going to school. And when I walked into his home, it was bare, it was empty. There was no furniture in the place. There were 2 or 3 mattresses in bedrooms, and there had to be probably 12 to 14 people living in a 3-room apartment. And it was just
Sounds horrible.
poverty-stricken.
Yeah.
And emotionally, it caught my attention. There was a mother and a father, a grandfather, grandmother, and a whole bunch of kids and cousins. And it really impacted me, saying, and I think at that point, realizing how freaking fortunate I was in growing up as a kid and all the opportunities I had. I was back to UMass on the GI Bill. I graduated, both my degrees were paid by the government after spending 4 years in the military, so I considered myself very fortunate. And I knew that I was going to be able to help people. So that's why that all unfolded.
So what was life with Andy like at that time? I mean, you were young.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
You know, I think at a younger ages, so I went in, say, in 1967. I was 20 years old when I went into the military.
Sure.
I was dating Andy, my high school sweetheart at the time.
Yeah.
Very much in love, but we had no idea what the future was going to bring. So I went my way to California. She went to the University of Massachusetts. And during that period of time, we were on and off again. And I got to tell you, it was heartbreaking. When I think about it as I'm talking to you right now, it's a little emotional for me because I really loved Andrea. But the time apart, the military, fortunate enough I would go home on leave, what they called at the time, to visit enough to keep that spark and flame alive. We wrote each other daily. I even, when I was overseas, because as I shared with you, one of my stints was in Vietnam, where I was on an aircraft carrier, and we were gone for 8 or 9 months at a time out to sea. I bought a tape recorder, and so that we were able to converse on these little tapes about this big around.
Yeah. I'll bet you couldn't wait for one to come back.
It was great, and we were able to share our feelings and emotions more so on a phone or a letter, and so I still have those tapes today that my children know about probably, and if they listened to those tapes, it would blow them away.
I'm going to tell them.
In terms of the emotions and the love we had for each other. But that, I think that kept us together.
Yeah.
So I was still in love with Andrea. And during my final year when I decided to go back to school, I knew that I was still in love with Andrea. That's one of the things that drew me back to Massachusetts. I played a lot of basketball in the Navy. I was a really good athlete. And I had a full scholarship, full boat to San Diego State from a coach that used to come down and watch me play basketball when I was in the Navy. And I could have stayed there. And if it wasn't for Andrea, I would have. But I decided to come back to Massachusetts and go back to school there.
So what year did you get married? Where in this whole story did you get married?
We got married in 1973.
Okay.
And
What were you doing at the time?
at that time, I was working at the state employment office and had just transitioned into another job from the Department of Social Services. I worked as a social worker. I was a licensed social worker for the state of Massachusetts, that a lot of people probably wouldn't know. that was a period of time that, again, I parlayed that degree in counseling psychology, and Andrea and I had lost a child. Before our two other children, Ross and his sister Ashley, was born, we had a daughter, Nicole, that died of SIDS.
Yeah.
So it happened during that transition. And I interviewed for a position at the Department of Social Services as a human resource manager. And I interviewed with a state representative from Chicopee, Massachusetts, whose name was Frank LaPointe. He's still a friend of mine today. I got linked to Frank through some people up in Holyoke in the political arena that got me an interview with Frank. And when I went in to interview, I blew that interview so bad because I had just lost a daughter that I did not only not get the job, but it was just a total nightmare. Well, fortunate enough, someone that I knew in Holyoke, Massachusetts, that knew Frank, called him up and told Frank that I had just lost my daughter. I had not told him that in the interview. They gave me a second chance and an opportunity. I went back down and interviewed, and they hired me because I think I did pretty well after the fact and drew myself together in a lot more composure. But I ended up being hired in a human resource position for the Department of Social Services that protected children in the state of Massachusetts.
So, did you get a lesson out of interviewing once and a second chance? I'm a big second chance person. I think that it's pretty interesting, and I think we learn a lot from getting the opportunity to have a second chance.
You know, I was so fortunate that Frank LaPointe, who I said is still a good friend of mine today, probably recognized what I was going through emotionally.
That something was off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the lesson for me was I've always been someone that has worn my emotions on my sleeve. And I didn't do that in this interview. And perhaps if I had, they might have been more understanding at the time, and who knows what would have happened. But hiding that and oppressing it during that time probably was not healthy in retrospect.
Yeah, that's
But
interesting.
to this day, I think as I talk about career and family, and most people that know me as being a pretty straightforward, no nonsense, no bullshit type of guy.
Yeah, that's how I know you.
That tells it as it is.
That's how I know you. Yeah.
And wrapped around that story, back to what I was doing before Giombetti Associates, I remember talking to a lot of people about going into business for myself. And one of them said, so you're going to go into industry and tell executives what they need to hear. And I said, yep, that's what I'm going to do. And he said, well, you're probably not going to be in business too long. Back to that frankness and forthright. I always believe that honesty and truth and sharing directly with someone what they needed to hear versus what they wanted to hear, I always thought there was real value in that.
That must have been very powerful in your role at DES. When you're dealing with troubled folks, being very direct and telling, it's medicine to them, right?
You know, what I learned about myself later on as we talk about maybe Giombetti Associates, I had an opportunity. I think I was fortunate because of my counseling and psychology background. But later on, I had an opportunity to find out about myself. When I went into a graduate program, it's kind of like going into psychotherapy. In this program I was in, if they did not see the skill set that you needed in terms of the intuitiveness, empathy, directness, and honesty,
Emotional intelligence.
Emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
They would bounce you from the program and ask you to leave because they perceived that you wouldn't have that skill set. So I found out later on in life through some behavioral instruments, some in college and some that I developed along the way, that I was a pretty empathic individual with a strong degree of sensitivity and emotion, but I had a strong passion. And I think some of it comes perhaps from my military background, being a Vietnam veteran. I always believed in doing the right thing. And that implied honesty and integrity and character. And so I think that's where that came from.
So I have an interesting question for you. I understand that you and Andy started one of the first community residences, and I'd like to hear what Was this right at the same time? Same time period, or did it come after? Tell me a little about that. I understand it was one of the first in the state.
Well, that brings back a lot of memories. Yes, it was one of the first programs under the umbrella of what they called Goodwill Industries. And they were taking deinstitutionalized individuals out of Belchertown and Munson state hospitals and putting them into community residence programs. Andrea, my wife, had worked at Munson State Hospital as a vocational counselor. So that's how she was introduced to the field. So she knew a lot of people, and when they started opening these, called them group homes, community residence for these individuals coming out of those environments, they were looking for what they called house parents. And so Andy and I put our name in the hat to be a set of house parents for a particular community residence.
Sounds like you had the perfect credentials for that.
You know, it was interesting. What just popped into my head as you're asking me questions was, I remember being interviewed by a PhD psychologist for this position, a parent within this community residence program. And he was an older gentleman at the time, and very distinguished, and he was kind of, doing a psych evaluation on me in terms of whether I could handle this as a house parent.
Sure.
And being in Vietnam, when he asked me that kind of question, I looked at him and I said, well, I was in Vietnam and I was on an aircraft carrier, and I lived in a space, a berthing space where you would sleep with 3, 6, 9, so 8 other people and myself, and a space that was like 12 by 18 feet. So if you can live in that kind of space and get along with people, I'm pretty sure that this house parenting job is going to be not easy, but I'm pretty sure I'll be able to make a pretty positive transition into that.
How did Giombetti Associates begin? What were you thinking?
I don't think I was thinking anything. It happened serendipitously. I was working in human resources at Sweet Life Foods in Connecticut.
Right.
And I went away on vacation while I was there, came back, and found out that I was one of 250 some odd people that was being laid off.
Oh boy.
It was a real eye-opener. I had a wife, young kid. So at that point, I said, okay, what am I going to do? So I was out of work. I started interviewing around for jobs. Did a lot of human resource interviewing for whatever positions, and said, you know what? This thing, psychology background, maybe I'll try my own thing. I thought about Giombetti Associates, came home and announced it to Andrea. I said, I'm thinking about going into business for myself. She was supportive, go for it. Talked to my father-in-law about that. He thought I was crazy.
Sure.
Going into some entrepreneurial thing that couldn't support a family, but I decided to do it.
So what would the structure have been? What would you have to offer when this was a brand new idea for you?
That's a great question. Yeah, great question. I was fortunate. Because of my role in the community in human resources that got me out and met a lot of people. And in my previous jobs, I know a lot of people. I approached a whole host of companies. And at the time, I got 6 of them to put me on a retainer. The largest retainer I had was $12,000 annually.
That's big money back then, right?
It was, and they ran from 6 to 8 to 10. Well, I think one of them was 12. I got those 6 companies to put me in the black. I hit the ground running. I was so fortunate. People that hired me either as their human resource manager, director of human resources, or some form of fashion of human resource support in their companies. I even had a company give me a car to entice me to come to be their employee, to be a human resource manager when I split from industry. So I did it. I jumped in both feet. Had no idea what the hell I was doing. And for anyone that tell you that it's not scary, they'd be crazy, because it is. I had no idea where I was going, what it looked like, supporting a family. All I knew is I was on a path. I was passionate about that path. And I knew I had the self-confidence that I could deliver and do something great.
So you were like a human resource consultant.
That's exactly what I did for those 6 companies. I acted as their human resource consultant, either in the capacity as their human resource manager, director of human resources, et cetera.
So that's a lot to juggle with 6 or 7 different companies.
Yeah.
What were the struggles with that?
Wow. Again, as I think in retrospect, I think one of the things that always provided some foundation of success for me was balance of life. I was never a workaholic. So back to being honest and direct with people, those 6 companies that wanted to put me on a retainer, I was right up front with them. I wasn't going to work 70, 80, 90 hours a week. I wasn't going to be there on call if you call me Friday, Saturday, Sunday, every hour of the day. That's not who I am. That's not what I'm looking for. So if we can have that conversation around what I am looking for, what I can do for you as a human resource manager, I thought I was pretty talented. I think I could do a lot for the clients that, put me on retainer. And if we came to an understanding, so I went off in that direction, and I don't think I ever met any of those real challenges other than juggling the time of supporting 6 companies.
So tell me about the early rewards. You saying that you hit the ground running, it was successful right out of the gate. How'd that feel? How'd that conversation with your father-in-law go after you got off the ground?
I think I had mixed emotions. On one side of the coin, it was exciting as hell. A young entrepreneur.
Yeah.
I was in my mid-20s. I'm out there doing my own thing, and I'm thinking, wow, this might work out for me.
Yeah.
On the other side of that coin, when I went home to sleep at night, I'd be thinking about where the hell is the next paycheck coming from, or what am I going to do after this annual retainer is over, because they only put me on an annual retainer for 1 year, so I had to worry about everything. And when you wear an entrepreneurial hat, you have to worry about marketing and sales and running the business and being the consultant and cleaning the toilets and the IT person or whatever. It was overwhelming at times, absolutely overwhelming.
Wow. Who were some of those first customers? Do you remember?
Well, besides, by name? Oh, yeah. The firms that put me on retainer?
Yeah.
Hayes and Paper in Holyoke was awesome.
Yeah.
They put me on a retainer, and I knew the Hazens really, really well. I helped their sons, both Bob and John, transition into that organization. Sweet Life Foods, the company that had laid me off, put me on a retainer to do some select search and recruitment for them.
Okay.
And some assessment work on the behavioral side. They kept me on staff on a retainer. There were a company in East Long Meadow, Veritech, Steve Graziano.
Yeah, I remember Veritech.
He gave me a car along with that $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 to keep me connected to his company. He was a great guy. Ronnie Skoll hired me, and I functioned at Chez Joseph as their human resource manager. And I trained Ronnie's wife, Lori. I trained her over a period of years as a really fine human resource professional. So I was really, really fortunate. But it was hard work. If anybody tells you that it's easy being an entrepreneur, it's not. It is hard work. But what I knew about myself, because of my behavioral background, I had gone through assessments. One of the critical things that led to the success of Giombetti was a behavioral instrument that told me about myself. I knew who I was. I knew I could do this. I just had to have the confidence to move forward. Those companies provided that confidence, I think.
I think so too. What were the right type of clients for you?
Well, it's interesting that when I went in to assess somebody as to whether they wanted me, potentially, as their consultant. But more importantly was, did I want them?
So you were selective.
Very. And as a human resource manager, and I'm coming to your question, that I realized what was important and of value to me. Honesty, integrity, caring for people, being empathic, helping people to grow, being direct with individuals. As a client base, I always had to be honest with them and tell them what they needed to hear, not what they wanted to hear. So the right type of client had to be at least open-minded and receptive to everything I just said. And I would ask them that before we would come to an agreement and they would hire me and I would engage them as a client. We'd have to be on the same wavelength. And believe it or not, because of my psychology background, I could sort those things out almost instantaneously.
Sure.
When I was chatting with an owner or a president or an executive, I could tell whether they were or were not compatible with the foundation of what I perceive to be world-class leadership themes.
So you had early clients or potential clients that you decided not to work with?
Oh, yeah.
How did it feel to walk away from them knowing that you had a young family at home? You
Well,
talk about sleeping at night?
That's an insightful question, Kenny. Mixed emotions.
Yeah,
I'd walk away feeling great knowing that I had done the right thing,
yeah.
that this leadership thing. So what I really wanted to focus on in my consulting business was world-class leadership. And so I was on one side of that coin anxious, walking away from a client that I knew would support my family, but I would have to either subjugate myself or to do things that weren't in my character to fulfill their perspective or need or their philosophy of leadership that was totally different than mine. On the other side of that coin, I was elated to walk away thinking, you know what? There's no way I want to work with you. Autocratic, dictatorial individuals, poor listening skills, inflexibility, no compromising behavior whatsoever. I said to myself, is that someone I want to consult to? Or if I said yes, I'd have to see a glimmer of hope in those individuals that I knew I could move in some new directions, that I could see something there that they would listen to me. They would, in my consult to them, they would say, you know what, this guy means well, he cares about me as a growing and emerging executive, my company, leadership. So the passion that I brought in being honest with them, I think people saw it pretty quickly. But so I had mixed emotions in terms of your question.
So I want everybody to understand what was at stake in those times. What was the economy like then?
I built a house back in I don't remember the exact years, but interest rates were at 18% at some time
yeah.
when I built a house. The economy wasn't great. And so I was a struggling young entrepreneur.
So those were big decisions. There's a lot at stake right there.
Yeah, there was a lot of stake in terms of what's going to happen to me. They say behind every successful entrepreneur or executive is someone. And that someone for me was my wife, Andrea.
Yeah.
And I get emotional about it, even talking to you about it.
Yeah.
Because in terms of being successful, it's not all about you and your skill set.
Yeah.
It's about the relationship you have with others. It's about, in Andrea's case, she was 1,000% supportive. And at the time, our son Ross, who was born in 1978, I knew that I had to support this family,
Yeah.
and I wasn't going to let him down. So
Yeah.
I knew I could do it.
I know.
Yeah.
That's interesting. All right. You good?
Yeah, I'm good. I get emotional. As I said, I wear my emotions on my
I
sleeve.
know.
There's no hidden agenda with
I
me.
know,
And
I
I
know.
think that's what a lot of clients, they either appreciated that in me or thought I was an asshole, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
In terms of being that direct.
I haven't decided yet. I'm on the bubble.
And that leads me back to the conversation I had about this guy before I went into business. He said to me, so you're going to tell executives what they need to hear. And I said, yeah, that's exactly what I'm going to do. And he said, you're not going to be in business too long.
Yeah.
I said, well, let's see what happens.
Sure.
Well, there I was 30 some odd years later. I guess the formula that I chose and the path that I went down and the foundation of leadership, I think, worked for me because people trusted me. They knew that I was honest and sincere and passionate about what I did.
Yeah.
You always didn't like what I told you,
Yep.
but it was delivered in a way that was in the best interest of you personally and professionally, the best interest of your company and team, and hoping to move you in a direction that either short or long term, in retrospect, you might come back and say someday, you know what, I'm glad I met that Rick Giombetti.
We should probably get a box of tissues because Barbara Walters has got nothing on me. I'm going to make you cry all day long.
Well,
right.
you know, I've had an interesting career. It's been extraordinarily rewarding.
Yeah.
I wouldn't change a thing.
All right. Let's shift gears here. I want to talk about, so I've been through some of your testing and evaluation, and I want to know more about that because it's mind-boggling to me, the assessment that I went through, how accurate it was, and I answered questions that didn't seem to make a lot of sense to me.
Innocuous questions.
I mean,
yeah.
do you wash your hands and feet, and do you run? And I mean, just crazy, crazy questions. And when it was all said and done, the assessment was extremely accurate. I'm dying to know what's behind that. Can you tell? And that's Performance Dynamics.
Performance Dynamics is our baby, trademarked and owned by Giombetti Associates to this day. And I have to give credit to my past job at Sweet Life Foods when I was in human resources. They had a consultant who tutored me a little bit, and he exposed me to a couple behavioral instruments that one measured leadership and an instrument called the Thirstone Inventory that measured characteristics of general personality. Because of that experience at Giombetti Associates, eventually I brought aboard a gentleman that worked with me. His name was Paul Alves. He had a background in psychology, worked with me for 20 years. And he and I developed this program. When I got out into industry, there were hundreds of assessment instruments that were available to any psychology person that you could use to evaluate personality, behavior, whatever it was. It took me years to find the right ones. And I put together this group of 5 paper and pencil exercises that identified...
Non-related?
Non-related. And like I said, it took me years to find them. And because of all the work I was doing with them, I was using these instruments in real time to assess people like yourself, executives, individuals, all kinds of role, function, and responsibility in companies that I was learning about. I was working in a learning, living laboratory of personality and behavior, learning about it on a daily basis. So Performance Dynamics was our vehicle.
It was born out of...
It was born out of Paul Alves and I and Andrea flying to Washington, trademarking it, and we were babes in the woods.
Yeah, how did that go? Tell me that story.
You know, we got on a plane one day. Paul and I are sitting in a conference room in Giombetti Associates saying, we need a name for this thing, these behavioral instruments that we were using. We had no name. So we scrolled through the archives of past trademarks and trademarks. We went through the dictionary. We did all kinds of things. Said, what are we going to call this thing? We agreed upon Performance Dynamics. And we thought of gears meshing together.
Okay.
And Performance Dynamics was the interaction of all these characteristics of personality that drove behavior. So it was a perfect fit. Long story short, got to Washington, we find out that the trademark was already taken. We were depressed. We had flown there that morning.
How can that be?
We didn't do the research up front to see if Performance Dynamics had already been taken.
Okay.
When we got there, we went to the trademark office. We're downstairs in the archives of this huge federal building, going through files and files and files of things. We're looking for Performance Dynamics, and boom, there it is. It comes up, and it's owned by a company in Maryland. Paul and I and Andy, we're depressed. We came all this way for nothing. All of a sudden, we look on it. It says, in arrears for back taxes. They hadn't paid their taxes. Paul was great with people. Somehow, he made some relationships while we were there. They bring us up to the attorneys, 3 levels up from the basement, and they introduce us to this attorney that trademarks, and he walks us through this process. I don't know why. It was serendipitous as I started this conversation.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, we're there, and he says, okay, this is what you got to do to request and trademark Performance Dynamics. We had to put ads in papers around the country. We had to put them in Maryland. For 1 year, we had to do all these kinds of things. We did it. And fortunate enough, I guess the company, we had to contact the company that hadn't paid their back taxes. I guess they weren't interested. And lo and behold, long story short, Performance Dynamics gets awarded to us in 1988. After 2 years of going through the machination of trying to get it trademarked, when we got the plaque in the mail, 1988, it says first use. The plaque says, I think, May of 1990, that we awarded the trademark. We were jumping up and down for joy.
Yeah, that's a big
We're
step.
saying, whoa, this is huge. Performance Dynamics, the behavioral instrument that would propel us into the future, was now ours. It was pretty damn exciting.
So the business is up and going. You're feeling pretty good about it. Tell me about some of the early successes.
You know, back to wearing all the hats in any organization. It was just Paul and I.
Yeah.
And Paul called me out of the blue. I just happened to know Paul. We got together. And so off we went. In the marketing sales side, so you had to be on the road every friggin' day looking for business.
Yeah.
Not only were we doing the work as a consultant, Whether we wrote handbooks, labor relations, employee relations, hiring, firing, termination, the legality, the legalese of human resources, we did it all under that umbrella.
Let's talk about Paul a little bit. I know Paul's gone now. I know he was a big part of your business and part of your family. Tell me about Paul as it relates to your skill set and his, and why it works so well together.
Well, that's another great question and very insightful. I'll apologize up front. This might get a little emotional for me. Paul died 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And he had a background in psychology. I learned a lot from him. He was a genius IQ-wise. He was I know this because I tested him before I brought him into the business. I assessed him.
Yeah.
He was in the 98th percentile for intelligence. He was a very bright man. He was extraordinarily reflective. It's a trait that you can measure called reflectivity. It drives insight, intuitiveness, common sense, etc. He was in the 98th percentile. He was a creative genius, literally, but out there, sometimes off the wall.
Yeah.
Said shit could have come out of his mouth that put us into trouble sometimes with our clients, etc. But it was unbelievable. Yeah. And so, but in learning about him, his skill set was different than mine. He was a risk taker, highly competitive. I was highly competitive.
I was going to say, you're highly competitive.
But he was highly competitive. That's why we got along so well. The first book he had me read was a book called Tales of a Reluctant Messiah by Jonathan Bache. And it was a book about letting go and moving on and growing in life. And when I read that book, it changed my life in terms of perspective, attitude. So Paul and I worked together. He was extremely personable. He was more talented than me in a whole host of ways, intuitive as hell, had a sixth sense just like me. His background was in psychology.
Yeah.
So we worked together pretty well.
How would Paul describe you?
Oh, man. He wasn't afraid to tell me behind closed doors. Intense, sometimes a shithead, arrogant, poor listening skills.
He described you that way?
Yeah. And I believe a lot of that is probably true.
Do you think that's why he gave you the book to let it go?
Probably.
Yeah.
You know, and at the time, I was probably now in my early to mid-30s. And I'm sure I was a lot of those things. But I think what separated me was I always took feedback really well. And I give part of where I wound up in career, not only to Paul, but to the director of human resources. And I remember his name to this day, and it's 40 years later. And Sweet Life Foods, his name was Ted Gawanter. He was my boss at Sweet Life, who I worked for 5 years. He was very open, honest, and direct with me. So between he and Paul, they helped me grow in terms of learning about myself.
Okay. So tell me, what's behind the magic of Giombetti Associates?
You know, magic's a good word. The performance dynamics process is and can be extraordinarily inspiring. And it's inspiring because you'll learn about yourself. The magic is in the instruments that we use. And over the years that it took me to bring this package of these instruments together, I found that they worked. They measured concepts of personality that were extraordinarily accurate, wrapped around themes of conflict, communication, interpersonal skills, leadership, decision-making, creativity. We could sort those things out concretely in percentile ranking to say someone was in the 30th percentile for compromise, meaning you were pretty stubborn, inflexible, weren't very open-minded and receptive to feedback. So the magic was we no longer, it wasn't opinion anymore. We had some factual information to back up. I could say to you, hey, Kenny, I think you're pretty opinionated. And you could say to me, Rick, I think you're pretty opinionated. Never shall the twain meet. You're entitled to your opinion, and I'm entitled to mine. Now we're looking at a number.
Scale.
And now we're looking at a number, and we can come back and say, hey, Ken, you're in the 15th percentile for compromise here. You don't have any. Rick's in the 65th percentile for compromise. He's open-minded, flexible, adaptable. You're the problem here. And so the magic is in back to the reality. I've used that word a number of times. The reality check for people in finding out about themselves through this exploratory process of performance dynamics to uncover themselves, learn about themselves, and then hopefully have the ability to move in new directions. The magic was wrapped around in the presentation, the passion of Paul, and others who have come and gone in Giombetti Associates to deliver that message in a supportive, nurturing way that caught people's attention, not only through the numbers, but now we're telling you that. And then linking the conversation in a developmental way, because remember what our focus always was and will be, I'm sure in my son continuing the business, is world-class leadership. Being honest with people. And the magic is in understanding.
So oftentimes, you can explain that, but you have to demonstrate it. And how do you do that for a new prospective client? How do you bring the future into the present and get them to buy into it? Because if you told me that and I knew nothing about Giombetti's, our Giombetti Associates, I would say I'm probably not going to try that. I believe you believe it, but am I going to try it as a prospective client? How'd you do that?
That's a great question again.
Was it referral based? Did you test somebody up front to show them the accuracy? Was it through conversation? How'd you get buy-in in the market?
I'm going to define it as a potential prospective client. A potential prospective client would come to us a number of ways, either through a referral, word of mouth. You as a president, owner of another company, I might say to you after doing business with you for a year, hey, Kenny, do you got any friends in YPO, Young Presidents Organization? You have any other executive friends that might be interested in a relationship like this? And we would bounce off that. So if they picked up the phone and called another owner and executive of another company and said, hey, this is Kenny, I'm over at XYZ company here. You need to talk to this guy, Rick Giombetti. He does some pretty interesting things under the umbrella of leadership and human resources, and I think he can do some things for your company. Home run, right?
So referral based.
Best case scenario. We did some marketing for a while, all kinds of things under the umbrella of performance dynamics, and that worked pretty well.
That's good.
We had some information we sent out into industry to executive leaders to entice them. We wet their whistle on the behavioral side. And I remember one of the graphics that Paul had a friend in Northampton that was an artist. And the first piece of marketing we developed showed a caricature of a person hanging on a coat rack. And it said, why hire off the rack when you can get a custom fit? The custom fit being the personality and behavioral piece.
Yeah.
And then we had a graph underneath it and some information. We used that as a marketing ploy. So option 2, we did some of that. Best case scenario was referrals, and we always asked for them.
Yeah, okay. Was there a time when you knew you made it? We talked about risk, we talked about Andy, we talked about how things got rolling. How'd you know when you made it?
Wow. My gut reaction to your question, my first reaction was, as an entrepreneur, I don't think you ever know you made it. If you have passion for what you do, it's an ongoing journey. And here's the good news for me, and I hope I've passed it along to my son, Ross. Money never motivated me in life, ever. It wasn't about money. It was about building things. It was about developing world-class leaders. It was about moving organizations in new directions. It was about all of that.
About moving forward all the time.
All the time as an entrepreneur. And to this day, money doesn't motivate me. Friendship motivates me. People motivate me. Experiences motivate me. Life motivates me.
Yeah.
I'm passionate about all of those things, literally.
Yeah.
And so, to your question, when did I know I made it? When I had a little more free time. I was paying the bills. Mm-hmm. I was living a reasonably good life. The associates that worked with me, I treated Paul. My father taught me this in business. I learned a lot from my father. he said, in business, if you don't have to, don't ever establish a partnership because it's too difficult in decisions, in relationships. It shatters relationships in terms of partnerships. And I took that to heart. And I've had various people throughout my career that worked with me that Paul asked me for a partnership. Others that work for Giombetti Associates asked me for partnership. And I never went down that road. I remember what my father told me. It can ruin a company and relationships. But I treated them like partners.
Okay.
And so those people that worked with me, I think I knew I had made it when they made it. I always cared about them. I treated them magnanimously. They were paid well. I think after a good number of years that we knew we were solvent financially, and we started making some serious money, I think we all felt like we made it.
Yeah.
But for me, I've had some people work with me that enough wasn't enough. Paul was not one of those guys, but others that had worked for me were. I never appreciated that foundation or insight that they had as what truly motivated them. If you wanted to come to work within Giombetti Associates and work with Rick Giombetti, if money motivated you, you probably weren't going to get hired by me. I knew we had made it when we caused change, changed people's lives. I can't tell you how many marriages I've saved because of performance dynamics.
So, Rick, tell me, do you live and breathe by what you use, the tools you use? Do you take it home with you? Do you use it at home? Do you use it in your life? Is it part of you?
You know, I think any entrepreneur, whether it's our business or any business, they're obviously passionate about what they do.
Yeah.
And if you're passionate about what you do, you believe in your product or whatever that is. Yeah, I'm entrenched in performance dynamics and have lived my life that way in terms of trying to do the best that I could in life, bringing up family, raising our children. Ross, our son, Ross, and Ashley, his sister, they've been through performance dynamics more times than I care to talk about.
Yeah.
I started them at 16 years old.
Yeah.
So I believed in what I did and tried to pass that along to them. And I guess what popped into my head was practice what you preach.
Yeah.
I preach performance dynamics, being a good person, having integrity, character, empathy for others, acting like a world-class leader, trying to be flexible and open-minded, all those things. And I'm not always successful at them. I'd be the last to admit it. But I'm conscientious of them every day.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I'm most proud of Ross, our son, is that he's extraordinarily conscientious about that on a daily basis because I set that foundation. So through the living of performance dynamics and helping others to understand themselves, it makes them better people. It makes us all better people. Wouldn't it be great if we could create a culture in life that was just full of good people? It would be friggin' awesome. It would be like Nirvana, died and gone to heaven.
Yeah, it's enhanced your life.
It's enhanced my life for sure. And I think back to your earlier question about how did you know you were successful or when you succeeded? You succeed when you help others to succeed. And it's
That's the real treasure.
lack of selfishness,
Yeah.
caring about others. And I think we'll probably talk about it maybe later on, but what I'm most proud of our children is that my wife, Andrea, and I set that foundation.
Yeah.
That foundation is solid. I'm really, really proud of that.
Well, I really enjoyed talking to Rick and learning an awful lot about the beginning, Giombetti Associates, and your time prior to Giombetti Associates. And I'm anxious to hear about the transition and learn about your son Ross coming into the business and the changes that he's made and the business as it exists today. I guess we'll do that in part 2.
Right, I look forward to it. There's an interesting story, and we'll get to in-depthly talk about that as we go along. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
All right. Thank you.